Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our strategy roundtable today. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, giving people a chance to join us. We have folks joining from all over the world, so welcome from wherever you are. If it's morning, afternoon, or evening, we're glad that you're joining us today. So just give us a minute to again welcome people, and then we'll get started.
And if in the meantime you want to maybe quickly, put your name in the chat and where you are based, you're very welcome to. And then, as George just said, we'll get started in just a second.
I also see that several of you have requested permission to record. And just to let you know that we are recording the strategy roundtable today, and we'll make that recording available to everyone. So if you'd like to record it yourself, you're welcome to do that, but really no need because we are recording it, and we will make that available along with all the resources in a day or so after we're finished.
And I'll use the opportunity to remind everybody that there is a YouTube channel where all the previous recordings of our roundtables are located. We've been covering a whole range of interesting themes. At least we think they're interesting, and that's the feedback we've been getting. So feel free to have a look.
So Christoph, if it's all right with you, why don't we get started? We have a number of folks that have joined us, so welcome. We are pleased that you took the time to join us today. This is one of our ongoing series of strategy roundtables, and this is, I think, a very important and timely topic, and we have a terrific panel today joining us. So again, as I mentioned before, this meeting will be recorded and resources will be shared afterwards for all of the attendees. So we have started the recording. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. And as we go along, we will try to address them. If not during the webinar, we will address them at the end. For those of you who haven't already signed up, we have a sign up Google form, and we'll post that in the chat so you can get future announcements about strategy roundtables as they occur. So I'm happy to be here with all of you today. My name is George Edwards. I'm the Chief Accreditation Officer at the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, NEASC for short. I'm the host, the host for today's roundtable is Dr. Christoph Ott. Christoph and I have been doing these for quite some time, and we're really pleased to be able to continue. Christoph is the former head and board member of the Lausanne American School in Lausanne, Switzerland. He is currently the Director of Quality Schools Certificate, a Swiss-based quality certificate for schools, and an executive partner at GenerativeHumanae, a firm focused on helping organizations evolve and change through empowering its teams and its people. He has an extensive background in management expertise in international markets and guiding organizations to achieve long-term goals. He's skilled at introducing new and innovative ideas and implementing them through empowerment, motivation, and inspiration. Christoph lives in Lausanne, Switzerland with his wife, Gosha, and his children, Jonas, who's 13, and Alec, who is 12. So at this point in time, I'm going to hand things over to Christoph to get us started today. Christoph?
Thank you, George. And I just realized that my kids are 14 and 13 now, so I didn't update that portion of my bio yet. I hope they don't listen. So my co-host today is George Edwards, who is the Chief Accreditation Officer of the New England Associations of Schools and Colleges, where he assists schools throughout New England and around the world in the process of continuous improvement by participating in accreditation. George was a public school educator in the USA, serving as a high school principal for over 20 years. George was the founding principal of several schools, including some designed according to the NEASC standards, and George lives in Sunapee, New Hampshire. So many of you are recurring participants in this roundtable series, and we're both very, very grateful for you. For those who might be new here, As George said, this is recorded. We will then upload the recording onto the YouTube channel, and we will send you a PDF of the slides and of the resources and some of the lightning questions. There's a short series of very personal questions that we ask the panelists to answer, inspirations, podcasts, favorite books. And from that, we basically share this all with you in a follow-up email. So anybody who is on the list would obviously receive this. Feel free to share it and disseminate this far and wide as you wish. We are on 2.5 years of this roundtable series with George. So I think we're at number 11 or 12. So we do this about twice a semester. And it all started out with George being my host at the NEASC annual conference, where I was presenting around the strategic visioning and interviews I had done of heads of school around the world through Zoom during the pandemic. And I had taken my school as an American school through that same process. And out of that, we had just a lot of enjoyment of working with each other, and also identified a niche and a need that schools tend not to talk with each other enough, in our opinion, about strategy and about key topics. So this is really our intention, is to really give you all here, participants and people who view this online later, an opportunity to hear some best practices from people in the field, outside of the field of education also, because our panelists, we have two, or one, Val is from the field of education, and today we have Michael, who is from education, but in the tertiary space, and Charlotte, who comes up with business context. And this is really something, a format that we've come to enjoy and like and gotten good feedback on. So there will be a 1-hour presentation followed by a 30-minute fireside chat. So before we dive into the presentations by each of the panelists, I'd like to maybe introduce them to you. And first of all, thank you to the panelists one more time for taking the time to be here with us and to share with us what you're doing. And our first panelist will be Charlotte. So Charlotte Blonois, she's the founder of GenerativeHumanae, and she inspires and engages organizations and their teams to create a world to which others want to belong. Sharing new ideas and approaches around leadership and empowerment, Charlotte works with leadership teams on their own change and development by building on the strengths they already possess. With qualifications in neurocognitive sciences and coaching, as well as an MBA from the Carroll School of Management in Boston, Charlotte has spent 15 years in leadership roles in multinationals such as Nestlé, Medtronic, or the Bayer Crop Sciences. She also teaches management science and leadership at educational institutions across Europe. So Charlotte is joining us from Lausanne, and if you can give us a little wave, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
Okay, it's my turn.
Charlotte, let me just quickly present the two other panelists, and then I'll hand it over to you, and we'll go through the slides if that's all right. Okay. So the panelist right after Charlotte will be Professor Michael Thomas. Michael is joining us here from London. He made a point of showing us his very messy office in the background with a big smile on his face, obviously. But he's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck University of London and director of the University of London Centre for Educational Neuroscience, the CEN. The CEN is a cross-institutional research center which aims to further translational research between neuroscience and education, and to build new transdisciplinary accounts in the science of learning. In 2003, Michael established the Developmental Neurocognition Laboratory with Birkbeck's world-leading Center for Brain and Cognitive Development. The focus of his laboratory is to use multidisciplinary methods to understand the brain and cognitive basis of cognitive variability, including a focus on neurodevelopmental conditions. So we will get the real scientific angle of the brain science and how this works in teenagers from Michael. Again, Michael, thank you for joining us from London here today. The third panelist today is Val Gardner. Val is joining us here from Vermont, and she has been in service to educational working as a high school teacher, coach, athletic director, assistant principal, and principal at Champlain Valley Union High School. During her career, she has worked on numerous statewide projects and currently serves education by working with educators and groups on a variety of projects as an adjunct college professor, and as director of the Vermont School Leadership Program. She serves as the president of the Vermont's Principal Association, chair of the New England Association of Schools and Colleges Commission on Public Secondary School, and was principal in residence for the U.S. Department of Education and is an associate member of the Headmasters Association. She has been a member on various boards, including UP for Learning, Vermont Health Foundation, and Young Writers Project. Val earned her BS from University of Vermont and her MS from the University of Oregon, and in her free time, she enjoys the beauty of Vermont and fly fishing. So Val, thanks for joining us. And I think with that being said, I'd like to hand over the word to Charlotte, who's going to tell us a little bit about her approach in the adult and business world when it comes to neuroscience.
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. So thank you for all of us to listen to that. I'm not an English native speaker, so I will try to do my best to be the more understandable as possible. So what we do with company, and as you said, Christoph, is in the adult world, is to develop the full potential, both in terms of strategy consistency and leadership, I would say, and leadership, but also team building and understanding how human can be really a huge average for the performance of the company. So as you said, we use neuroscience, but compared with Michael, it's a really, I would say, vulgarization of neuroscience, just also for us to help people to understand the mechanism which interfere in strategy, and to be able also to help them to give their best. So that's really the purpose of our company, is to empower people, and neuroscience are super interesting for that, because people are more willing to understand their own behavior and after that transfer that to positively to their team. So the experience I'm going to talk about is really how we encourage and how we guide the companies with neuroscience and neurocognitive science to build strong and consistent strategy.
I have a feeling that it might be the same. I have a feeling that
could I ask all the participants to go to mute, please? Or maybe George, could you intervene as host? I think it's Brisa who is not on mute right now.
Okay, so GenerativeHumanae is an organization with more than 10 people, and they are all extremely powerful in transforming organizations. So GenerativeHumanae empower people, but also organization. I think that both there is two part of that: people and organization. And I think that this is a meeting between the two, which is very interesting. So we can go ahead with the first slide. So once again, it's really democratization of neurocognitive science, just to explain how people can switch from a reptilian governance to a prefrontal governance. The reptilian governance basically is the governance of which is more a survival mode, and in this case, when a team, maybe you can go ahead with the next slide. This is the more basic governance, where people, and this governance is developed very early in the human beings, at the very beginning of a human being, at the first age of human being, and it's really the survival mode. And in this survival mode, you have 4 different behaviors, which is very classic. The fight, when you don't feel comfortable, you're going to fight or to escape, or to feel completely inhibited, or to feel in a calm mode. And in this case, this is more a governance where you are when you are under huge stress. And inside company, when you are under huge stress, you are not able anymore to connect with your full resources. And it's very interesting for people to say, okay, if I have a colleague, if my team is in this reptilian cortex, I'm not able to connect with the best part of the team and with their full performance. And it's very interesting also into the management world to be aware that this mode, this governance does not allow people to perform. So it's the purpose is how to go to transform this governance is in something else, to keep the energy, to keep the energy of fighting, or to keep this energy and to transfer this energy somewhere else. So let's go on. Let's continue. So the second governance is the paleolimbic cortex. This is more at 7 years old, when people are able to find their right position in a group. And it's very interesting to notice that this governance, I mean, at the adult age, at the age of adults, I think that it's very interesting to understand where are positioned people. Is it more in the dominance, submission? Dominance is more is more when yourself or your objective are higher to the collective objective. Submission is more perceived as the collective objective is more important than the individual objectives. And it's very interesting for COMEX or direction to better understand where we are today, in order to also to recreate a very nice collective dynamic. I'm not sure I'm clear. That's okay? Collective dynamic.
Yeah, the COMEX would be the leadership team in the educational world.
Exactly. There is a third governance, the next one, which is more the governance where you capture all the value, the fears, the dogma, the experience, the bad experience, but also the positive experience. This is more your automatic governance mode, and it's very interesting to know that this is because it's automatic. It's the way, in fact, people behave, and it's where people is going to find all the information to answer to adapt themselves to new situation. This is the neo-limbic cortex. This is very important for people to know what is inside, because it's very often a black box, in order to adapt their behavior to new situation. And it's also very interesting for management committee to understand what is inside, just also to be able to transform their behavior into new behaviors. But the most interesting governance is the prefrontal one. So it's the next one. Prefrontal governance is really the adaptation model mode. So it's where you find all your talents in terms of your analytical skills, but also your creativity, your intuition, your innovation, your empathy, everything which can really transform the world. And this is important, and knowing that we all have these 4 different governance. And the most, I would say, interesting to lead a company and to influence positively people is to be in touch with this prefrontal cortex, able to transform our behavior and to create a new experience. So the interesting part of making links between leadership and neuroscience is really to make people aware of their capacity to experiment these 4 different governance and to be able to join very easily this prefrontal cortex in order to transform. If you are always into your reptilian cortex, the first one, you are always reactive, and you bring the company into a very reactive mode. If you are in your prefrontal cortex, you really allow the company to find new solution into a very moving world, and being aware of this different governance gives them really strong leadership, because by being aware of your resources, individual and collective resources, you are able after that to create a strategy which is super impactful and adaptative to a new world, but also to inspire people, and also to embark a company to its future. So it's in this case, neuroscience is just a mean to bring the company and the management committee to a next level of awareness, and help them really to drive the company with always with new ideas, higher resources. So this is something we share just to allow people to be good leaders, and to be able to and we have a lot of different techniques not to fall into this reptilian cortex, very reactive, in a very survival mode, but more we have a lot of different tools to help executive committee to reconnect with their prefrontal cortex and be able to adapt their strategy and also their posture. So neuroscience helps us to transform, and help us to transform and to bring management committee into a better posture, better strategy, better behavior, and new ways of transforming companies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
So I think if I may maybe add a few words to this, because Charlotte and I work together, and it's been for me an incredible journey, truly, because everything that she brings to companies, which I'm part of her team in that space, is things that are very much translatable to the educational world. So whenever you heard her saying company, everybody on this call should think school. Whenever you heard about leader or management team, you can hear leadership team, you can hear academic leadership team in the school, but you can also hear teacher, because the teacher is a manager also of a classroom. And the amazing piece, and the most powerful piece, and I know Val will talk about this too, is the more you are able to build meaningful relationships with students when you're in the classroom, and the more you're able to build meaningful relationships with colleagues when you're at the desk in the management piece, the more you can help go through those very choppy waters we're going through in education right now, because the educational world has been changing and evolving very, very rapidly. And it's been amazing to see how this works in the industry space, in the corporate world outside of education, and how important this is to hear also in the educational space. So I don't know, George, if you had any comments before I hand it over to Michael.
I appreciate that we have all of these governances within us, and it seems to me that there are times when each one of them has an important role to play, and so being aware of them, being cognizant of them, and being thoughtful about where and when and how you use them, I think is really the key to good leadership.
And the challenge is the prefrontal cortex is not fully formed until you're in your early 20s. So when you are in education, you're either dealing with the Neolympic or the Paleolympic if you're in primary versus secondary space. So you also have a big, and that's why it's so powerful to be in that age bracket when you're in education, because you're impacting the developmental phases of a young adult in becoming.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Thank you, Christoph. You were perfect to translate with it, because I'm very used to do it in French and it's deeper. But thank you, Christoph, for this for this help and interpretation, which is good, between imaginary world and the school world. But really be aware of how we work as a human being and transfer that to the organization, private or school, is a huge added value in the way to create cohesion between people, global understanding, proximity between peoples, and also empathy. I think that that's key to create a world where people want to belong to. That's really one of my preferred definition of leadership. Leaders create world where people wants to be, in which people want to belongs to, and I think that knowing this kind of mechanism, brain mechanism and cognitive mechanism, is a real added value, and you see the impact in organization when it's well mastered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. And I can only encourage you to look at the links, especially the articles and the recommended reading, especially the recommended reading. The reading list of GenerativeHumanae is really, really cool. I found a lot of books that had resonated with me, and also books that were brought to us by previous panelists. So Charlotte, thank you very, very much. I'd like to maybe hand the word over to Michael and let him take us through a different angle of that diamond in the rough that we're looking at from different perspectives.
Super, thanks very much. So George, I have quite a few slides, so you might have to be lively on the keyboards. We'll see. Okay, so relatively short presentation. I just want to give you an overview or a sense of the research field of educational neuroscience. So next slide. So educational neuroscience, it's part of the new science of learning. Psychology and education have had a long relationship over 100 years to understand how learning works and how that can help teachers. More recently, through advances in AI and machine learning, we've had a deeper understanding of the different ways in which learning can work in different mechanisms. And advances in neuroscience, particularly brain imaging techniques, have helped us understand how learning actually works in the human brain. So educational neuroscience feeds off this combination of different disciplines. Next slide. So our focus of educational neuroscience is to try and help improve educational outcomes by understanding more about neural mechanisms of learning. But if you're going to do that, you need to understand the broader context in which mechanisms of learning are falling. So we can think about mechanisms of learning as being a sort of child or individual level factor at the center of this diagram. So things like ability, motivation, attention, but also things like health and nutrition. But your learning outcomes are constrained by other factors as well. So factors at the school level, what the school policy is, what the teacher skill level is, and so forth. And that in turn is constrained at the broader level of society and family factors, such as families' socioeconomic status, the technology available in society, and cultural influences. And in the educational field, there's still a broader kind of national level about national level curricula or education policies, or the amount of resources put towards education. So although I'm going to be focusing on neural mechanisms of learning, we have to understand that in a broader context. Next slide, please. So how are we going to connect between neuroscience and education? Kind of images of brains lighting up seems quite far away from education. You can think of two pathways that the neuroscience might help teachers. One of those is via the pathway of psychology. So as we understand more about how the brain works, we can improve our psychological levels, our psychological theories of learning, say about how we learn to read or learn about science, or how we control our behavior, or the differences in children with neurodiversity. But there is a direct route where we can just think of the brain as a biological organ and think that that has to be in the best condition when it enters the classroom. And therefore, we're thinking about things like diet or stress or sleep or the fitness of the child and so forth. We're trying to have the brain in the best condition when it comes into the classroom. Next slide, please. So I'm based at the Center for Educational Neuroscience. This is sort of a university-based research center. We're trying to contribute to building the evidence base around what are the best techniques for learning and education. To give you a flavor of the projects, here's some of the ones we've carried out recently. There's one on counterintuitive concepts in primary maths and science learning. If I have time, I'm going to give you a flavor of that project. We do some work following up a cohort of teenagers, having a look at their cognitive skills, how they use their mobile phones, and how that affects their mental health and how all of these things affect their educational outcomes. We've been doing some work in low-income countries, trying to understand brain principles of plasticity and how we can support adult literacy programs in those countries. We've been having a look at how family-level factors such as socioeconomic status influence children's longitudinal outcomes, both cognitively and in education. And we're currently doing some work to find out what educational techniques best work for children with special educational needs. Next slide, please. Okay, so all of that, again, fits within a broader context. Educational neuroscience is a particular field, but there is a broader movement to involve the science of learning in education and try and take an evidence-based approach to education. So instead of fads going, we'll try it this way this year and this way next year, try and gradually accumulate an evidence base about what is the best approach to take in the classroom. It's never going to be the same for all children, so it's about what works best for what children in what context. In the UK, we have a particular organisation called the Education Endowment Foundation that's been responsible for building this evidence base. And you can just see a graph there, which is the output of this organisation. They've been running lots of evaluation trials to find out how effective various different techniques are for improving educational outcomes and how much they cost. So on that graph, you'll see, for example, that having smaller class sizes is very expensive and doesn't yield big effects on outcome. That's the evidence. Whereas if you look at metacognition, training children to understand more about their own learning abilities, that's fairly cheap and has quite big effects on outcome. That's a kind of UK perspective, but there is a broader international perspective, particularly led by UNESCO, which has been running an evaluation of the future of education. And they recently published a report called the International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment. And you'll see in there both evidence and science. So it's an indication of a kind of broader approach. In this approach, there is a focus on evaluating what works. And in some of those cases, it's about the kind of gold standard randomized control trials. And that's because it is quite hard to work out what works best in the classroom, and it's quite easy to fool ourselves as educators. So we do need to collect evidence about this. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the goal here? It's not going to be prescriptive practices for teachers, but it's methods to increase teacher knowledge to support their autonomy. So sometimes it feels a bit strange that teachers are still trying to change something, that is the brain, without knowing anything about how it works. So that's why I was delighted to hear Charlotte's talk. And therefore, the ultimate policy goal really is to influence teacher training and continuing professional development. It's not about telling teachers what to do, but about empowering them in their practice. Next slide, please. Luckily, in the UK, the government is reasonably open at the moment to a sort of theory-based, evidence-based approach to teaching teachers. That's a couple of examples: the Early Career Framework and the Early Teacher Training Core Content Framework. These are what the government thinks teachers should know in the UK, and in there is some kind of science of learning content. Next slide, please. Not a lot of that content at the moment is neuroscience inspired. So what is the added value of neuroscience? Well, we've heard a little bit of it from Charlotte. I would add a couple of things such that learning in the brain tells us that most of that learning goes on in content-specific circuits. So when we train on tasks, we just tend to improve on those tasks. And it highlights the challenge of finding ways to apply our skills or knowledge to new situations. The other thing we can draw from an understanding of what goes on in the brain is what the brain's priorities are. Mainly, the brain is a sensory motor device to deliver the right motor skills in response to your perceptual input. Its next priority is like emotions and rewards, things that are really important. We are social primates. A lot of the brain is just about other people. And only in fourth place is cognition, the kind of things that academic topics are normally focusing on. So, I mean, very broadly construed, this tells us that if we want kids to learn about art or science or maths, we need to make sure those first three priorities are not getting in the way. So that there isn't noise outside the classroom, so that the kids are curious about learning, not anxious about learning, and that they're trying to use peer approval to support their learning rather than to distract them. Next slide, please. Okay, just another context thing. Educational neuroscience focuses on pedagogy and teaching methods, but again, got to understand what teachers' priorities are. These are the results of what was foremost in UK teachers' minds a couple of years ago. And you can see that most of their worries about workload, about funding cuts, and about student behavior. So one just have to understand the context of trying to support teachers with more knowledge that will help their practice. Next slide, please. All right, a little whistle-stop tour of one particular project. Children struggle, young children in particular, struggle to learn concepts in maths and science that seem inconsistent with their prior experience and their prior knowledge. To give some examples, next slide. 6-year-olds are taught that the world is round, but they've been playing football on flat pitches for like several years. Next slide, please. And as 9-year-olds, kids have to learn that it's the Earth going around the sun. So even as adults, when we see that sun dip below the horizon, it's quite hard to tell ourselves that actually it's the horizon rising to cover the sun. Next slide. So sometimes the knowledge seems inconsistent. So a dolphin, is that a fish? No, it's a mammal, but it sure looks like a fish and does the same kind of thing. Next slide, please. And kids, young kids, 4 to 6-year-olds have learned finally that 5 is bigger than 4 and 4 is bigger than 3. But then someone puts a dash in front of those numbers, and now we have to know that -5 is smaller than -4. Or we put a 1 and a line over a number, and a 5th is smaller than a 1/4. So a lot of these represent inconsistent knowledge. That's hard for kids to learn. It's a classroom challenge. What does neuroscience tell us about that? Next slide, please. Oh, skip over that. Geometry is confusing. So what we know is that when children learn new knowledge, they don't overwrite their previous knowledge. They learn it alongside their intuitive knowledge, and then they have to learn to control their knowledge so that they retrieve the appropriate information. And there's neuroscience work that says the better you are at say, physics, the better you are at controlling your knowledge. So what we know is from we can do training to improve that kind of control skill. So next slide, please. So this is a project. Oh, the fonts look horrible on this. Sorry. This is a project where we work with teachers to develop a learning activity with children, 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, to help them stop and think when they're reasoning about science and maths problems, to make sure that they retrieve the right knowledge and don't have an impulsive sort of intuitive response. Next slide. That's a little bit about what the game is like. It's for kids, a kind of game show where they're presented questions about science topics or maths topics. Next slide. That's an example, say, as a counterintuitive thing of click on all the pictures that are living things. Young kids think that anything that moves is alive, but of course a fire moves but is not alive. Or what number is shown by the blocks? Well, that's 43, right? 4 lots of 10 and 3, but you could say, well, actually there are only 7 things there, so maybe it's 7. Next slide, please. We have an activity. We work with teachers to show that it might work. Then we had to evaluate it in a big trial, 6,000 children in all these skills across the country, and randomized web active and business as usual control conditions. Next slide, please. When we do that, this was funded by the Education Endowment Foundation. It adds to their evidence base. It shows that, in fact, these techniques, it's like 3 lots of 15 minutes a week. This activity, instead of normal science or maths teaching, adds 1 month of progress in maths and 2 months of progress in science for very little cost. So reasonably successful. Next slide. Okay, so I threw in these slides and I didn't know where I was going to get this far. So just, I happen to be here and it says 2 minutes on the chat. So in that case, one of the questions I'm asked about educational neuroscience is this going to overturn everything in education? Is learning about the brain going to cause ourselves to completely change what goes on in schools? And broadly, I'm going to say no. Most of what's going on in understanding how the brain works and how those insights can improve teaching will lead to incremental improvements. But I think particularly in the pandemic with children and adolescents moving a lot to online teaching, we did get a glimpse of a potential radically different way of doing teaching. So if you move to the next slide. So already out there is a method so powerful that the teacher soon knows, the student soon knows more than the teacher. It's a method by where the child learns by exploring and interacting with a curated virtual environment. The child can self-regulate, sometimes explore, some of the times do tutorials to learn how to solve problems. Yeah, don't give it the game away there, George, for a second. Older children, you know, the challenges that are being faced can be matched to the skill level of the child. The child can even start to set their own problems. It's problem solving in a social environment with their peers. It's incentivized and reward based. You can have point schemes and so forth. And in that context, what does the teacher do? They don't stand at the front of a class telling their students. They are the curator of that virtual environment. They create the learning environments and perhaps just give children tips about how they might solve particular problems. We know that this is optimizing many of the ways the brain learns best through exploration, construction of knowledge. It has social elements, it has reward-based elements, and so forth. The big challenge, so that's out there. Next slide, please. The big challenge for that is that's my 7-year-old playing Roblox on an online game, right? So my kids love this. They seem to learn loads from it, but so far we have not been successful of turning these game frameworks into useful educational formats. And generally, from my perspective, they're just anxiety inducing, making me worry that my kid is spending too much time online. But there are inklings there that we can use technology to harness many of the factors that most enable the brain to change itself and to learn. It's how to do that in a way that meets our educational goals. Next slide. That's my summary. Educational neuroscience is a translational field based on the dialogue between all the stakeholders. At its heart, our insights about brain implementation constraints, how the brain actually learns, and the goal is to improve students' educational outcomes and health. And that's everything. Thanks for your attention. Next slide has resources and acknowledgements. Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
So I put the other slides in the addendum, and oh my God, Michael, thank you so much. And this is one of the reasons why George and I love doing roundtables, and one of the frustrations while doing them, because this was really insightful. And there are a lot of pieces I'd like to pick up on, but it feels so we've scratched only on the surface of many of the things you could be sharing. And for time reasons, you know, you have to go through things. But and we have the fireside chat afterwards, which is going to be an open discussion of things. But I think the one thing I want to kind of pick up on and start drawing a red thread between what Charlotte was saying, what you're saying, and then hand it over to Val is the awareness and the empowerment. I've now heard this so clearly from both of the first two panelists. Like, give people the awareness so that they can be empowered and become their best selves. And I'm deeply, deeply, deeply convinced that the best teachers make the best schools. It's like the best managers make the best companies. So, you know, you cannot do enough in that space to really create a learning culture, modeling good behaviors where the adults are learning as much as the students are learning. So I think for me, there are many, many more things I'd love to say about what you said, Michael, but I don't want to shortchange Val, who's got some amazing things to share with us also. And we have that slot at the end too. So George, is there anything on your end you'd like to add at this point?
No, just that Bert has a question in the chat, and Bert, I think those would be great questions for the fireside chat. So I hope you'll stay with us, and you'll have an opportunity to ask them when we open things up. All right, so Val is up next. Val, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte and Michael. I come at this from a perspective of being an educator for a very long time and finding out what worked and what didn't work simply by experiencing it. And when education began looking to neuroscience, there became a framework for me to use that was really just put some language to it and move from intuition to being able to help people create mental models around it and help bring the neuroscience and how the brain worked in. So if we could start the presentation. So I work with the idea of how do we bring all this, and then how do you design with the brain in mind? Next one. These two people played a big role in helping me frame the work. Christian Jernstadt's at Dartmouth and is a neuroscientist, and his wife is a kindergarten teacher. And so he actually had a wonderful laboratory to try his ideas out, because he'd try an idea and his wife would go, no, Chris, no, let's figure something else out. Bill Rich is one of the most creative high school teachers, and he spends his time now working with teachers and schools to help them figure out how do you bring, as Michael, you said, that knowledge into the classroom in a way that makes sense and is transformational but incremental and doesn't overwhelm them. So I thank them for helping me provide this foundation. Next. This is something that I've used from a very long time, which is Sleckley's work on engagement, because in essence, you really want the brain to be engaged. And one of the things that I found is these 5 types of engagement. When you talk to people, they look and they say, oh yeah, I got that kid and that kid and that kid and that kid. I also looked at it. I've got that teacher, that teacher, that teacher, and that teacher. And so my work is, how do I really move them to that type 1, high level, high attention and high commitment, which Charlotte, you were talking about in terms of how do you help them belong? And when they are engaged, generally there's higher belonging. Next slide. I worked for a few years as principal, and I believe my job was leading at that point. And what I found out is everything I learned as a classroom teacher, I forgot as a leader. And something happened, which was I shifted my thinking from my job's not about leading. My job is about how do I have everyone in this organization learn. I had 1,000 kids at that point, and I realized I can't teach 1,000 kids. My work is how do I have teachers be in service to the learning of kids, and how do I help them grow? So that was a huge shift for me that really changed my approach to how I organized the work that I did with my school. Next one. The other thing that in conversations with Chris, I would say, Chris, I bring a strategy to a faculty work session. We do it, and I go back in the classroom and I see nothing happening. And his comment was, transference doesn't happen automatically. Some people do it. And transfer, which is you were talking about, Michael, to some degree, the idea that you don't move one concept to another, or you get an interference and it moves there. So one of the things that I have to do intentionally is, how do I help them bridge it? So the example, just adding a question once we've done an activity in a work session, asking the question, how do you see this being used in a classroom? How could you use this with a kid? using a math and science teacher who would be complaining, the science teacher would say to the math teacher, you're not teaching them how to do multivariable equations. And when you said to them, are you bridging that for kids? Are you using chemistry equations in Algebra 2? And are you taking Algebra 2 and using an Algebra 2 statement before you do a chemistry problem? So transfer really becomes, in my mind, one of the most important things you have to focus on and requires very, very clear intention to do. Okay, next. The other thing that became really important was this statement was made by Chris Jernstadt. And when I started teaching, teaching was didactic. What you were saying, Michael, is the teacher standing in front trying to orchestrate. Because you're really developing new pathways, it all of a sudden made sense to me that the person doing the work is the person doing the learning. And that fundamental shift, I teach, and one of the students in my class came up to me and said, you know, I want to teach like you do. You do nothing in class. We have to do it all. And what I understood was my work was in the design and how I set that up. So next slide. But in order to do that, what became very, very clear are these are a set of guiding principles that I use whenever I'm doing work, whether it's leading work or learning work. Learning social, as you said, Michael, in terms of the brain, having that social aspect of it. So my work is to build relationships, and that was with teenagers, that was with students, that was with families, that was with teachers, that was with my colleagues. And the reason that was the place is it helped me link into their background knowledge to be able to help them contextualize what we were doing. I'll give you an example. A kid was not able to understand ratio and proportion. I knew the kid drove a very fast car. So I asked him, what do you have for a transmission in your car? And we went through the ratios between first, second, and third gear. And he said, is that all ratio and proportion is? He said, everybody's been trying to teach me through pizzas and all of this other stuff. So building those relationships becomes really, for my sense, how you beginning foundations for learning. Getting back to Charlotte, your issue of the governance is, if it's not safe, they're not thinking. They are reacting in that rebellion. They are not making, no cognition is happening, whether it's a faculty member, whether it's a student. The other piece is make it meaningful. How do you find out what's meaningful for people? Again, connect to their foundational knowledge and background, make it something that's relevant and folks can do as part of their work. In other words, we were spending a lot of time providing extra things to do for teachers rather than building on what they were doing and adding additional things to it. We were taking them down the piece that you were saying, Michael, about change the lesser or minus or the minus sign. They were seeing that as how we were approaching their learning rather than building blocks towards it. Give time for consolidation, which means let the brain work on it a little bit before you ask them to try it or do something. The other piece that I found in my own work, I find with teachers, stories are powerful and they're a great way for the brain to be connected. Absolutely. People connect to that, the brain. The other component is it needs to be retold and reframed over time. Telling the story once does not create a stick in the brain. Next. So what's my work in the learning process? As I said before, it's design, diagnose, and demonstrate. 3 components in what teaching is and what the learning process is. Next. I'm going to have, if we think about interdependent principles around how you design, how do you engage people socially and emotionally so they're vested, they feel that they're belonging? How can we engage them in more targeted practice? Using some of Doyle's work from Talent Code, compressing the field and making sure everybody gets a chance to play and get engaged in the learning. How do we provide really good specific feedback to them? And what I would say is I believe the feedback, the more it's peer driven, the greater the learning. The more it's driven by a supervisor or more it's driven by a teacher, it's less learning. And then what are the stories and images that can we return to so we cultivate a mental model of why, what, and how, where we're going with the learning. So it was not uncommon for teachers to know every meeting and every time they would interact, here's what the focus was and here's the work that would be brought. So it wasn't this collection of here's a Monday meeting, here's a Thursday meeting, and the agendas were not linked and were not aligned. Next. So the design elements that become important when you're thinking about that design component. How do you get an emotional trigger? The brain's curious. How do you make it, wow, what is that? How does that happen? How do you have mental models of what you're looking for or what the learner needs? There are many times I'd be an example, somebody came to me and said, you know, kids can't write editorials. I said, did you show them what an editorial is? Well, why would I need to do that? Because of our background knowledge, about 20% of the kids knew what an editorial was. 80% of the students didn't. That's the same when we start working with the adults in our building. Targeted practice. How do we provide the opportunity to practice these things and it looks like what you want them to do? Grant Wiggins always talked about coaching soccer and doing drills. And then the kids would get in the game and it was nothing like the drill. And the kids would be saying, what is this? What's going on? How do you do the same thing with your faculty? And how do you do the same thing with students? And then explicit feedback loops that are tight and linked to the performance that you're asking for. Next one. Diagnose. That's what you're doing as the designer. You're beginning to say, what's the monitoring or feedback processes? With students, those may be few and far between, or maybe at a summative, but we don't get into the formative piece. How do we get those metacognitive skills developed? How do we provide opportunities for teachers to get feedback and know where that feedback's coming from? How do I look at the work being done both from the perspectives and needs of both the learner and the system, which is getting to yours, Charlotte, in terms of what's the organization need to be doing around this work that supports the learner, whether that's the student or whether it's the organization or the system. How do I move the perspective from solving a problem to creating something that works? And my work is in leadership, everybody would have a problem and there'd be 19 fix-its. And then you get into a debate, you get into those governances of people saying, this is the answer. And so how do you, when you're diagnosing something, move it to what are we trying to create here, which generates a lot more energy than the argument of what's the right fix? How do I check my assumptions? Okay, next. The next piece is where do I get demonstrations, both mental models to guide the work and then how to show what learning has occurred. And I've done a shift here using Wiggins and McTighe's backward design from a DUK, know, understand, and do, to a DUK, which is what do I need to do? And then what do I need to do to demonstrate, what do I need to understand and know to do that? Next slide. Michael talked a little bit about this, I think, Charlotte. How do I diminish the things that can interfere with the learning process? How do I make sure the interference is not there? Because the brain is going to pick up on all the things and it's going to diminish what the brain is going to put into memory around the specific learning. Next slide. The other thing that I say to people is I come from a place where people want to just work harder, and they work harder and longer and longer. I'd offer, when do your best ideas come to you? They don't come when you're working hard. They come when you're running. They're coming when you're in the shower. You're coming in the middle of the night. And what that does is it is saying that let the below conscious brain take all the work that you've done and come up with some answers rather than sitting there and trying to figure it out. Next one. The other piece is approaches for growth. Be aware, have an intention, and then practice and engage in the work. And then the last slide. This is a picture that I put over my desk, and it just reminded me about my work. It needs to be joyful, the kids on a bike in snow, and how do you just explore? And I always found visual images really important to remind me of my story. So that's my piece. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much. And again, I don't even know where to start, because there's so many things. Again, like we just heard awareness one more time on the slide. It's make the people aware, give them a chance. One thing that is also really important is something that I've also heard from Charlotte and from Michael is create a world that people want to belong to. And what you said, Val, here when you talked about the KUD or DUK, well, in the business context, Charlotte uses this because I've seen her do it. Is like instead of going from A to Z when you're planning something, actually start with the Z and then work your way backwards, because you create intentionality, you create a vision, you create a story. Story is a super powerful mechanism, and from there you work your way backward because you're biasing yourself from a cognitive perspective towards the positive as opposed to towards the facilitators as opposed to the inhibitors. So it's super huge and insightful. So I think George, I think we can slowly flip it over into the fireside chat, because I'm expecting a pretty vivid discussion because there's so many interesting things that were mentioned. Before we do that, in case anybody has to jump off, I just want to one more time thank the panelists for taking the time to prepare for this and for sharing their insights. And I think with that being said, you know what, let's just open up the floor. And if you want to pick up on Bert's comment, George, maybe summarize it and start with that. Why not?
Well, let me go back. Bert, do you want to address the questions that you posed? I know one of them was about the impact of space on learning and on education.
With pleasure, with great pleasure. First and foremost, thank you very much for this powerful, insightful, inspirational talks. I really loved all of your presentations very much. You know, coming from both sides of the world, from the educational side, but also from the business side, I see a lot of similarities. When I talked about the psychological framework, or when I listened to Michael's work, for instance, it reminded me to our work when we thought about how can we create spaces where people feel comfortable. And, you know, we started something which is called neuromerchandising, but that doesn't matter. But I want to know, is there any insight, you know, because nowadays we talk about something like biophilic design or even healing design. I think that in the space and the impact of the space can have a very, very significant impact on the teaching and on the learning as well. So this was my point there. And I have a lot of questions and observations, but let's start with this one. To Michael.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, space is a big topic, right? So the different way, when you said space, I first of all thought about some of the research we're doing about spatial cognition and how that's a kind of underemphasized component of many skills, particularly STEM skills, and how part of our work is advocating to policymakers to try and train kids in spatial skills and spatial awareness to improve their STEM learning. But there is this other aspect, which is the environment that learners are sitting in. We have some research going on in our center looking at like noise in particular, and how whether that's distracting or helpful. There's a really weird thing going on in classrooms in that we know that young kids aren't as able to screen out distracting information. And we know that by the time you're an adolescent, you're quite good on screening out stuff and focusing, right? So if you just think about the difference between a primary school classroom and a secondary school, the primary school classroom is filled with distractions and posters on the wall and bookshelves and everything. And the high school is all kind of white and blank and there are no distractions. It seems like completely the wrong way around, given the attentional focus ability of those kids. But I mentioned some of the work that's increasingly being done, particularly this is in the context of climate change and climate change anxiety, is to try and help connect young learners to the environment. There's a big issue with raised anxiety in young people about the climate crisis. And what we know about anxiety is if there's this threat that you don't think you can do anything about, and it's distant and amorphous, that just creates anxiety, right? And contributes to sort of problems with mental health. And in the UK, there's particularly a push to focus on how can we make this personally relevant to children, to think about the environment that their own school sits in, and to understand about, is there concrete things they can do to increase the kind of greenness of their environment? Can they plant wild seeds, and can they green or make more biodiverse their actual school campus? And then that feeds into what we understand about some of the kind of subtle work about how just being able to see trees reduces stress. And this gets into some of the work I don't know enough about. It fascinates me. It's kind of the neuroscience of architecture, and how there's this subtle thing going on that the space we're in sort of subconsciously activates various kind of motor routines. And even if those motor routines don't manifest in any behavior, they are sucking away our attention because we're having to suppress them. So I think there's a great deal of work that could be done in understanding how to optimize environments and do that in an age-appropriate way to get better learning outcomes.
Perfect.
Wow.
Thank you very much, Michael.
So I'd like to pick up on a comment that was early in the chat. Might have been you, Bert, again. And Bert, by the way, is a former panelist of the roundtable. It's the connection between the cortisol and the reptilian brain and the fear-induced, anxiety-ridden environments, and how that over time and how that would impact a school or an organization or a business. So I'd love to maybe hear a little bit, maybe first from Charlotte and then Val, a few statements about how the our brain impact if you play on fears or if you don't create a safe space inside of your organization / school. What does that mean? Oh, you're on mute, Charlotte. You're still on mute.
Do you hear me? Okay. On these specific points, I think it's very important to see the impact of fear on your ability to think and your ability to involve. I mean, fears makes, in fact, the flow of you focus on you are focused on your reptilian part, which really create cortisol, which create a bad feeling and don't makes you able anymore to think differently. So fears and one of the responsibility of managers is to work on their fears and to transform these fears to create new resources. If you keep these fears, this will not enable you to manage correctly, to be proactive, to be able to adapt yourself. So the big job to create agile governance is really to work on collective and individual fears, and to transform that into new ideas, new models, in order to adapt organization to the new world. So that's, I mean, fear is an energy somehow. It's an energy, and you need to take this energy and to transform them positively to create added value. And I think that it's the same thing for managers and for teachers, is how to use fear as a fire to create something amazing. But you need to transform, and the process of transformation is something. It's what we do, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, and I think Brisa had a comment earlier about devices, and I think there's generally a heightened degree of fear through information technology, through news and things like that, because like in the press that will say, if it bleeds, it leads. So we know that it's a powerful a powerful trigger. But I think I'd love to hear a little bit, Val, what your reaction is to what to the question and to Charlotte's comment.
I'd reiterate what you're saying, Charlotte, and I'd add another element to it, which is the self-management of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I spend a lot of time saying to people, this is Brene Brown's, who you are is how you lead. Yeah. And if you have a great deal of anxiety, that's going to play out in your organization many ways. And I had a very good friend who said, my job is to help moderate the anxiety that's in society coming into the organization.
Yeah.
Which places a huge responsibility on you, but also gets you to know yourself really well and know when you're being triggered into those positions. Because I've seen a lot of organizations that statement is true. Who you are is how the organization behaves a lot of ways. And then you add the other element for students, which is the associative aspect, which the brain is anticipating what's coming. So how do you work on a culture that allows people to really walk in there in their best self, rather than walking in there being afraid?
Yeah, that's totally true. That's totally true. And how to put also, we put passion and as you say, involvement and deep. Yeah, I agree with that. But this is as you say, this is a transformation process, and everybody, and especially managers, should be responsible for it. Right. From one part, and then change the culture through that. Yeah, I agree.
I think the other thing that's really interesting is, to look at the source of the fear, right? Because it can come from so many different places. It can be an external fear that the student or the employee is bringing into the school or the workplace, or it can be an internal one. So if you think about students, you think about, the climate that's created in the classroom or in the school. You think about bullying, you think about social media, you think about all of the different potential sources of the fear. But then everything in the school or in the organization can be going very, very well. There can be a great culture. It can be very accepting. But if the employee or the student is bringing the fear from home or from their environment or from their society, then you're going to have the same impact. So I think that it's really interesting to think about the source of the fear as well.
With that, though, George, I'd also say that is going to be the norm. I worked in a school with 1,600 people coming in and out of it every day, and to believe everyone was going to walk in there all right was a fallacy. So the leader's responsibility is, what's the knowledge base to know that's happening, and then what are the systems in place to help that individual or that group manage it in a way that it doesn't impact everything and helps them transform, as Charlotte is saying. So I think the piece that I'm always thinking about is you got the individual, but you've got a system response, and both of those need to be aligned in a way that helps move and keeps the brain in mind.
And I think to complete what you said is it's very important also for people who manage or even teacher to help students to segment what is under their control and what is not under their control, because I think that there is a mixture between different type of fear, and it's very important for them and for manager also to say, okay, you have you can act on what you have the control on, but you can't act on everything. And how can you segment the fears under control and the fears not under non-control? I think that this gives you a lot of feeling of power when you say, okay, this is out of control, so I have to forget that, and it's not part of my thought, but everything which is under my control can be transformed. And I think that having this conscious of what is under control and not under control is something which really is the transformation.
This is huge. I'd like to give maybe a little bit of space for anybody else in the participants group to ask questions. I have a lot of questions going through my head myself, so we will not be silent for the next 15 minutes, but I don't want to hog the microphone either. So does anybody else have questions or comments that they'd like to express? Okay, so Prisa, thanks for the comments. I love what you're saying in the word trauma. It is something that we have to be very, very sensitive to, and the word trauma has also at times been a bit overused because it's a spectrum again. So I agree, the fear and the trauma, you know, the things you bring from home, the things that are happening in the classroom, and creating that safe space is huge. So thanks for that comment. I'd like to now throw out something and see how this resonates, because I'd like to take this conversation into something that I've heard also throughout from all three of the panelists, is the importance of the relationship with oneself, this understanding of self. I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown, so work on yourself so you become your best self. You can then project that out. The relationship with the other, which could be a child, student, it could be a peer, it could be in the school context, a teacher, an administrator, or in the business context, and how much the example I think you used, Val, was the example of the car, and the fallacies that Michael was talking about, of how we're learning very counterintuitive things compared to our experience, and how much the importance of investing into a relationship is key to then enable learning and to replace or augment concepts that kids have through their experience that might not be the ones of the bigger scale. I don't know, Michael or Val, if there's anything that comes to mind with that kind of a theme that you'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, I would just emphasize how learning education is a social phenomenon, and that comes in many different flavors. But broadly, we can distinguish it between the students and the educators, and between the students and their peers. And both of those can play supportive roles in helping learning, but they can, of course, be barriers to learning. We know in particular in adolescence that there are developmental changes which alter the relevance of the peer group. So we know that all of a sudden impressing one's friends becomes much more rewarding in adolescence, and it can change the relationship. Actually, it can sometimes exaggerate the importance of non-parental adult role models. So all of this scaffolding, I think education isn't all social. Ultimately, we've got to learn skills, and we've got to have abilities, we've got to pass tests, and we've got to go out there in the world and be able to do stuff. And that stuff isn't always social, but we certainly cannot extract the learner from the network of relationships of which they are a part.
Which is what Val was saying when it comes to the most powerful form of feedback is peer feedback. And I really love that point, actually. You're on mute.
When I teach, I get it last. People have to peer review it before I get it. And then I add the elements to it. But I think there's a lot of material out there around how you build relationships with students. Very easy to do in terms of just taking the time to even put out a questionnaire. We used to ask teachers about the reading level of their students when they were coming to the high school. That proved less useful than asking the students what they read when they came in, because we would get things that the student doesn't read at all, and then we'd get information that the student was deeply into Tolkien's work, but he was viewed as a non-reader. So those direct connections with the students that's not out of the gate academically focused can make a huge difference. I'd also say just listening a lot of times. You'll learn a lot by just listening and asking a good question once in a while.
And something that I'm pretty sure Charlotte will bounce off of is this thing of it's the one doing the work who's the one who's learning. And in the business context, when somebody comes to you, or even in the school context, somebody comes to you, doesn't know how to do something, as opposed to tell them how to do it, just ask them, how would you do it, and come back again. Let's talk later.
Yeah, it's how and silence. I think that the how and silence, not to steal somehow the leadership of the person in front of you, it's just to help him to develop by himself its own resources. I think that's the basis of coaching. That's nothing amazing, but I think that's super important to give slow time, to listen deeply, to give slow time, but not to give the answer. I think it's a way also to infantilize, to make infantilize the kind of relationship. And if we want to make people grow, it's more how to create a relationship from adult to adult. And silence is key from my point of view.
And that works with kids too, to a certain degree, obviously.
I also have moved away from how can I help? That automatically puts a dynamic in the relationship. So I go, what would be useful right now for you? And then listen. But I'm also trying to learn about the person. And I agree with you, Charlotte, that if I'm giving answers, that's my context.
Exactly.
It's not theirs, and they have to have a context. So people accuse me of just asking questions, so I'll give silence. The other piece that I find time and time again when I'm working with new principals who have been exceptional teachers said, have you ever had that happen with a student before? And they go, yeah. And I said, so what'd you do? And they would go, well, I did this and this. Okay. So we think, yes, developmentally, there's a difference many times, but skilled teachers have developed a whole repertoire of skills that have become automatic for them. And when you have them think about it again, they can transfer that into another setting. It may be a little bit of a different context, but they can use a set of skills they've already developed in that other setting.
Mm-hmm.
I think, George, I don't know if you remember, one of our very, very early round table, maybe even the first one actually, we were looking at the strategic plan of Frankfurt International School. And there was something in there which completely blew me out of my socks and has stayed with me ever since. One of their mission statements, I believe it was, or one of their intentions was, I'm not sure on which level of the structure this was sitting, was like, develop a coaching culture. And literally, when I heard that, I was like, this is it. And this is actually a note I took when you were talking, Michael, of like, develop a coaching culture in a sense of helping the kids replace their knowledge, augment their experiential knowledge with the actual pieces, whether it's the world or the world is flat or these kind of things. And that's like the coaching culture. So I don't know if you wanted to maybe, if that resonates with you, Michael, if there's anything coming to you in that space.
Yeah, I think it's really important to give kids an understanding of their own learning, because I think that empowers them a lot, and to help them. I mean, we call it kind of metacognition. It's probably a little bit less with primary school, but the older individuals get, the more they can gain an insight into their own learning and understand where their own kind of mistakes come from, and how to get the best out of themselves. So I think we've heard that message from all the speakers, but self-knowledge of learning is a very important thing, and part of that can be informed by an understanding of why the brain works the way it does and the kind of mistakes it makes. And some of the times I think people gain by understanding how to incentivize themselves, how to understand what their own rewards are, and then to set themselves those rewards, to train themselves in a sense, rather than just thinking about knowledge.
I mean, the analogy that came to me as you were talking about the fact that people actually augment existing knowledge is like habit formation. The same principle applies there too, is you don't change a habit, you replace it with another habit. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the Pavlovian psychology or Skinner's behavioral psychology, it's all about, creating the reward and creating the feedback loop, and making it something that you'll bring into that very primitive part of the brain, so it becomes second nature.
Yeah, because for football lovers, soccer lovers internationally, once you've learned that the world is in fact a sphere, it shouldn't play the way you change the way you play football, right? You should still be kicking straight. So it's all about knowing what knowledge to apply in what contexts, right? Rather than overwriting all academic knowledge with your previous knowledge.
Are there any more questions, any more comments? Thank you for the comments in the chat. Jorge, I just saw yours. Great to see you too. And Tim Kelly from Stuttgart International School echoed what Frankfurt International School is also doing. So who knows who was first and where this came from. So I don't know if there's any more comments, any last pieces of information that you want to share before we bring this to a closing, maybe?
So I just, there was a comment in the chat about the role of technology, and I guess mobile phones and generative AI. I think I'm just going to flag that's a really interesting debate. There are some reactionary views out there. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt just had a book out called, I think, The Anxious Generation, which was quite anti the use of technology. I'm cautiously in favor, because I think it enables and empowers learners around the world in extraordinary ways. But obviously, there are the risks around age-inappropriate content and displacement of other activities and so forth. But, there's a big debate there waiting for another day.
Yeah, and I'll do a pitch to our own roundtable series. Our previous one, or the one before that, was about AI. Actually, it was a really, really interesting, thought-provoking one. So, Tim, I saw you came online, and we get to say hi. Say something, please.
You knew, Christoph, I would comment on something. And the issue is, no, Michael Johnson and Frankfurt International School is such a force of nature, and they absolutely were talking about coaching and had a huge influence on us. But what's really interesting to me, listening to this excellent roundtable, I thank our three panelists very, very much. What's interesting to me is how interconnected everything is. And I really, when you're talking about space, when you're talking about technology, to me, one of the things I noticed, Michael, in one of yours, it's talked a lot, with this question of small class sizes, and how most graphs would tell you that small class sizes don't really matter. And that's because, in my opinion, and reading a lot of the other researchers, that if you have a large class or small class is immaterial, it's the kind of relationships you have. So if you have a small class that allows you to build the kind of relationships that Val was talking about or Charlotte was talking about, then there's going to be huge impact. And technology does allow us to communicate in such a way. But to me, it always comes down to the relationships, whatever happens between the walls or under the roof or what have you. And this roundtable has really affirmed that. And so what's really great about this one is it's making the essential humanity of learning really come to the front. So thank you three very much for your sharing today.
You know, these are pretty amazing closing words, Tim. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a theater guy. What do you want? What do you want?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. And we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you that don't know, ECIS is an organization that is holding its annual leadership conference. NEASC is co-sponsoring it. So next week we'll be in Windsor outside of London, and just looking forward to seeing many of the people that were online today and having an opportunity to continue the conversation.
As chair of the organization, I have to say thanks, George, because I couldn't do it. So we do hope to see as many of you there as.
And I have ECIS close to my heart very often,
There
George.
you
This
go.
is the water bottle from last year's
Shameless
conference.
plugging. But honestly,
right.
ECIS and many of the organizations like ECIS, you know, we're all about kind of creating the kind of relationships that we're talking about here today. And that's, you know, we as adults are learners as much as the kids, and role modeling that is really important. And I am so with you, Val, on the fact that leading is how you taught. If you're once a teacher moving into leading, it's so clear. And the fact that you remind people that is really powerful and something I intend to steal.
There aren't very many original thoughts, right? We all steal from each other shamelessly at times. So I know I'll be stealing a lot from our three panelists and from our participants today. You guys have been great. Thank you very much.
Oh, and you will be getting a literally, like, this is like winning the lottery set of resources from all of the panelists, because and Val really even put in book summaries in terms of books that she recommends. So again, you will get a lot of added value beyond just the roundtable right now. I'll be sending that out hopefully by the end of this week, early next week, including the uploading of the recording here. Please, you know, share it wide and broad. George and I, this is a labor of love, what we're doing here, and we want to share this as far as we can. So we kind of rely on everybody who has been part of this adventure to help it grow.
So with that, I think we're going to bring the roundtable to an end. Again, thank you for hanging in there with us to the very end. We really appreciate our three panelists for their insights and sharing their wisdom with us today. And thank you to the participants who are still here for joining us. And again, as Christoph said, you'll be getting resources and you'll be getting a link to the recording of today's roundtable in the next day or so. So on behalf of Christoph and our panelists, again, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a roundtable in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, George, you can stop the recording, and if the panelists
Yep.
would have another few minutes with us, that would be very nice.
Yeah. Oh, right up here.